It was just another average morning in the small town of Willow Creek. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon as Maria Jacobs, a 32-year-old schoolteacher, prepared for another day of lessons. She lived in a modest apartment near the heart of town, a place she considered a quiet haven from the world's chaos. Her mornings were predictable. A cup of strong coffee, the soft hum of her favorite jazz station, and the hustle of getting ready for work. She didn't expect her life to change today. After all, it was just like any other day. Maria had been teaching for 8 years at the local elementary school. She loved her students, loved shaping their minds and hearts. To her, every child was a potential story waiting to unfold. But today wasn't going to be about teaching. It wasn't going to be about nurturing young minds or sharing knowledge. It was going to be a day that would change everything for her, for the community, and for the man who would play the biggest role in that transformation. As Maria walked out the door, her eyes briefly caught the familiar sight of Officer Ryan Callahan's patrol car parked across the street. He was always in the area, making his rounds, keeping an eye on the town. Most people in Willow Creek didn't think much of it. Officer Callahan had been on the force for nearly 15 years, and though his demeanor was cold and unapproachable, he was seen as a fixture in the town. He had a reputation for being tough on crime, and some even admired him for his no-nonsense attitude. But there was always something about his eyes, something distant, something that suggested there was more beneath the surface. But today, Maria would come to learn, there was a side to him that no one had ever seen before. She left for work as usual, walking briskly along the sidewalk, trying to avoid being late. Willow Creek was a small town, and people generally minded their own business. That morning, the streets were mostly empty. A few cars passed by. The occasional jogger took their route, but it was a sleepy morning for the most part. That is, until she reached the corner of Pine and 5th Street, where she was suddenly stopped by a sharp voice. "Hey, you there, stop." Maria froze in her tracks. She turned her head to see Officer Callahan approaching her, a stern expression on his face. He was tall, his uniform crisp and his hands resting firmly on his belt. His presence was commanding, and for a moment, Maria felt an unexpected knot tighten in her stomach. "Yes, officer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. She had interacted with him before, briefly, a nod here, a smile there, but nothing more than casual exchanges. He was the kind of officer who never really took the time to engage with people unless there was a reason to. "You didn't stop at the crosswalk," he said, his voice flat. "You're supposed to wait for the signal. Didn't you see the light?" Maria blinked, momentarily confused. She had been walking along the sidewalk when she noticed the crossing light at the intersection, but she hadn't crossed the street. She wasn't even near the crosswalk. The light had been red, but she hadn't been in any danger of stepping into traffic. It was the kind of harmless mistake that wouldn't even warrant a second thought. Yet here she was, being confronted over something so trivial. "I'm sorry, officer," she said, trying to explain. "I wasn't in the crosswalk, and I didn't cross the street. I was just walking to work." But before she could say another word, the officer's tone shifted. "Don't lie to me," he snapped, his face hardening. "I saw you. Don't think I don't know what's going on around here." Maria was taken aback. "I wasn't lying," she said, more firmly now, standing her ground. "I wasn't crossing the street. I was just walking." But Officer Callahan didn't seem to care about her explanation. His eyes narrowed, his posture growing even more rigid. "I've been on this beat long enough to know when someone's up to something," he said, his voice low and cold. "I don't like people who think they can just get away with breaking the law because they're too good for it." Maria's heart began to race. Something was off. Something wasn't right about this interaction. She felt her stomach churn as the tension in the air thickened. This wasn't just about the crosswalk. It never had been. There was something more. He was treating her differently, as if she was somehow guilty before she'd even said a word. Before she could speak again, Officer Callahan stepped closer to her, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. "You think you can just walk around here like you own the place," he said, his voice rising. I don't think I've seen you around these parts much before. What do you think you're doing here?" Maria was now thoroughly confused and starting to feel uncomfortable. "I live here," she said, her voice steady, but beginning to show the strain. "I work at the school." Officer Callahan didn't respond right away. Instead, he continued to stare at her, his gaze piercing. She felt like she was being examined, as if he was searching for something, anything, that would justify his suspicion. The air between them was charged, and Maria had a sinking feeling that the situation was spiraling out of control. "You're not from around here," he muttered under his breath, almost as if to himself. "I've never seen you before. You're not like the rest of them." "Excuse me?" Maria asked, a sense of alarm now creeping into her voice. "What do you mean, the rest of them?" But before she could get an answer, the officer's demeanor suddenly shifted. He looked almost panicked, as though he had just realized something he hadn't before. His eyes widened, and for a moment, Maria saw a flicker of something in his expression. Regret, perhaps, or fear. But it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. I need to check something," he muttered, pulling out his radio and speaking into it, his voice now shaky. "Wait here." Maria stood frozen, completely baffled. She had no idea what was going on, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this had gone far beyond a simple misunderstanding. What was happening? Why was he acting this way? A few tense moments passed before Officer Callahan finally spoke again. I need you to come with me," he said, his voice unsteady. Maria didn't know whether to be scared, confused, or angry. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was something else, something bigger than either of them could have anticipated. And it was just the beginning. Maria followed Officer Callahan in stunned silence as he led her to his patrol car. The air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken tension. As they walked, her mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. She kept replaying the strange encounter in her head. What did he mean by the rest of them? Why had his demeanor changed so suddenly, so drastically? Her instincts told her something was wrong, but she couldn't understand what. Callahan's stride was quick, almost hurried. He didn't speak another word as he unlocked the car, his movements mechanical. The early morning sunlight seemed to make the whole scene feel surreal. It was still quiet in the town, with only the faint sound of birds chirping and a few cars passing by in the distance. No one else was around to witness what was happening, and Maria felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding anymore. She could feel it deep in her gut. Something was about to shift. Once they reached the car, Callahan opened the passenger side door, the metal creaking in the stillness. He motioned for Maria to get in. Hesitantly, she slid into the seat, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to stay calm, tried to keep her thoughts clear, but the shock of the situation was taking its toll. She had never been in a situation like this before. As a teacher, she had dealt with difficult students and parents, but never anything that made her feel like she was under suspicion, like she was the one being scrutinized. Callahan slid into the driver's seat and started the car without a word. The engine hummed, and for a moment, Maria wondered if she had just imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was all just a bad dream. But the tension in the air, the way he hadn't looked at her since they got into the car, told her otherwise. She had no idea where he was taking her or what was going to happen next. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, until the sound of Callahan's voice broke it. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his voice softer now, but still laced with suspicion. "I know everyone in this town, and I'd never seen you before." Maria swallowed hard. She had lived in Willow Creek for over 5 years. She had a small circle of friends, a steady job, and was well known among the locals. The idea that Callahan didn't recognize her felt strange. It was as if he was looking for a reason to dismiss her, to make her into something unfamiliar. "I've lived here for 5 years, she said, keeping her voice even. "I work at the school. I'm just a teacher, officer." Callahan didn't respond immediately, and Maria's words seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. His knuckles were tight on the steering wheel, and she noticed his jaw clenched. He wasn't even looking at the road anymore. His eyes focused on something distant, something far away. His expression was one of deep concentration, but not in a professional way. It was as though he was working through something in his mind, piecing together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. "I don't buy it," Callahan muttered under his breath. "There's something about you, something I don't trust." Maria's chest tightened. The more he spoke, the more she felt like she was being painted into a corner, as if he was intentionally looking for a reason to doubt her. She had never felt more out of place, more exposed, in her own hometown. She could feel her palms growing clammy, her breath becoming shallow as she fought to stay composed. "You don't trust me?" she asked, a little more forcefully this time, her patience beginning to wear thin. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just going to work." Callahan didn't answer right away. The car sped down the road, and for a moment, it seemed like he was lost in thought. The tension between them had thickened, each second feeling heavier than the last. Maria was beginning to feel trapped, and that feeling was something she couldn't shake. Was he just trying to intimidate her, or was there something more sinister at play? Without warning, Callahan pulled the car to a stop by the side of the road, his tires crunching on the gravel. He turned to Maria with a sharp, calculating look. "I need to ask you some questions," he said. "Where are you really from?" Maria was taken aback. "What do you mean really from?" she asked, her voice rising. "I told you. I live here. I was born in Phoenix, but I've been living in Willow Creek for years. I'm just a teacher." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Phoenix," he repeated, his voice oddly cold. "That's what I thought. I knew there was something about you, something that doesn't belong here." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what he was getting at. Why was he bringing up her birthplace, like it was some sort of accusation? She had no idea where this was going, but everything in her told her this wasn't a casual questioning anymore. It was personal. It was like he was looking for a reason to discredit her, to make her seem like an outsider. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling now. "I've been living here for years, and I'm not trying to cause any trouble." Callahan didn't respond. Instead, he sat there, staring at her, as if weighing something in his mind. Then, with a sudden, jarring motion, he grabbed his radio and spoke into it. "I need backup," he said, his voice more urgent now. "I've got someone here. I need a unit to confirm some details." Maria's confusion deepened. Backup? What could possibly be so important about her that required backup? This was all spiraling beyond anything she could have imagined. Her stomach churned with dread as she realized that whatever was happening, it was bigger than a simple misunderstanding. It felt like something was unfolding. Something dark, something dangerous. As the radio crackled with static and a voice responded on the other end, Maria's thoughts raced. She felt like she was caught in a web, every word, every action making the situation feel more and more suffocating. She wanted to fight back, to stand her ground, but there was something in Callahan's eyes now, something that told her this wasn't just about a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was about control, about power, and she had no idea how to stop it. The air inside the patrol car grew heavier with each passing second. Maria could feel her pulse quicken, her hands clenching tightly in her lap. The tension between her and Officer Callahan was palpable, thick with unspoken words and rising fear. She glanced out the window, trying to steady her racing thoughts, but all she could see were the passing trees and houses blurring by in the early morning haze. The radio crackled again, the voice on the other end barely audible. Callahan grunted in response, his eyes never leaving the road. This isn't how it's supposed to be, Maria thought, her mind running 1,000,000 miles per minute. This isn't how it's supposed to go. I'm just a teacher. I have no business with him. What's he really after? Callahan's eyes remained fixed on the road, his grip tightening around the steering wheel as if the very act of holding on was the only thing keeping him grounded. The car was no longer moving toward her school or any familiar destination. Instead, they were headed toward the outskirts of town, toward a part of Willow Creek she rarely visited. The houses grew sparse, the streets more isolated, and Maria couldn't help but feel the growing sense of unease settle into her bones. This wasn't just a random traffic stop anymore. She could feel it. The way he gripped the wheel, the way he spoke into the radio. This was something different, something darker. Her instincts screamed that she was in danger. After a long, strained silence, Callahan finally spoke again. His voice was low and cold, carrying a sense of finality. "You know, I've been wondering about you for a while," he said, not glancing her way. "I knew you were different from the moment I saw you walking around here. Not like the others." Maria's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean, not like the others?" she asked, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions brewing inside her. "I'm just a teacher, officer. I've lived here for years. What exactly is it that you're implying?" Callahan's gaze flickered to her for a brief moment, his eyes narrowing in a way that made her stomach turn. "You're not what you seem," he muttered under his breath. "There's more to you than meets the eye." Maria's heart skipped a beat. What was he getting at? What did he think she was hiding? She had always kept to herself in Willow Creek. She wasn't involved in any scandals, had no criminal record, and had always been well-liked by her students and colleagues. There was nothing extraordinary about her. At least, not in the way Callahan seemed to be implying. Before she could respond, Callahan slammed his hand against the dashboard, making Maria flinch in surprise. "Damn it," he hissed, his eyes wild. "I knew it. I knew you were hiding something." Maria felt the blood drain from her face. "Hiding something? What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising now. Her thoughts were a chaotic mess. This man was spiraling, and she was at the center of it all. She had no idea why she was being treated like a criminal when she had done nothing wrong. She wanted answers, but the fear in Callahan's eyes told her that the truth was far worse than she could have imagined. He looked at her again, his expression now a mix of frustration and something else, something darker. His words came out in a low, almost reverential tone. "You're not just some teacher. You're more than that. And I know who you really are. I've known for a while. I just didn't want to believe it." Maria's mind raced. What was he saying? What was he trying to accuse her of? And why was he so convinced that she wasn't who she said she was? The silence that followed was deafening. Callahan's grip on the wheel seemed to tighten even more, his knuckles white. His eyes flicked to her briefly, then back to the road, as though trying to decide whether to say more or leave it at that. "I don't know what you think you know," Maria said, her voice quivering with a mixture of anger and fear. "But I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a regular person. I don't know why you're treating me like this." Callahan's lips twitched into something that could barely be called a smile. It wasn't comforting. In fact, it was unsettling. "Oh, you're regular, all right," he said, his voice tinged with mockery. "But there's more to you than just regular. I've seen it, and I won't ignore it anymore. Not now. Not after everything I've learned." Maria's mind spun as she tried to make sense of his words. "Learned? What have you learned?" she asked, the fear creeping into her voice now. "What could you possibly know about me that would make you act like this?" Callahan's lips parted, his breath catching for a second before he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "I know who your father is," he said, the words hanging in the air between them like a curse. Maria's heart stopped. Her father. He had been a name she kept in the past, a part of her life she didn't like to talk about. She hadn't seen him in years. He had been a former activist, someone involved in things that were too dangerous for her to ever truly understand as a child. Maria had distanced herself from that part of her history, wanting only to live a quiet, simple life. But now, Callahan's words sent a wave of panic through her. "You don't know anything about me," she said, her voice shaking now. "My father has nothing to do with any of this. I don't even know what you think you know about him, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't change who I am." But Callahan wasn't listening. His eyes glinted with a wild, almost feverish intensity, as if he were certain of some hidden truth that only he could see. "Oh, but it does matter," he replied, his voice thick with meaning. "It matters more than you'll ever know. Your father's ties, what he did, what he was involved in, it runs deep, Maria. And now you're here, just like he was. You think you can hide from it, but you can't. I'm not going to let you." Maria's mind was reeling. Her father's past, something she had buried long ago, was suddenly being dragged into the light in the most public way possible. She had no idea what Callahan was talking about, what connection he thought she had to her father's activism, his history. But she knew one thing. He was out of control. This was no longer just about a traffic stop or a simple misunderstanding. It was something more, something bigger than her, something tied to the past that she could never escape. But she wasn't going to let him control the narrative. She wouldn't let him win. Not this time. With a deep breath, she steadied herself and spoke with a quiet resolve. "You're wrong," she said firmly, her eyes locking onto his. "You don't know me, and you don't know anything about my father. I've worked hard to build my own life, and I'm not going to let you destroy that." Callahan's eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite read. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe something darker. He didn't speak, but for a brief moment, there was a crack in his composure, and she saw the panic that lay just beneath the surface. It wasn't just about her. It was about his own fear of what would happen if the truth came out. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, the car still parked on the side of the road, tension hanging between them like a storm cloud. Maria wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing. This was far from over. The moment had shifted, and nothing would be the same again. The silence in the car was suffocating. Maria's heart raced as she tried to process everything that had just happened. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from a deep primal fear. Fear of what Officer Callahan knew, or thought he knew, about her. Fear of what he might do next. She had hoped to put her father's past behind her, to escape it entirely, but here it was again, haunting her in the worst way possible. She had no idea what Callahan would do now, or if he had the power to turn this moment into something far more dangerous. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Callahan finally spoke. His voice was rough, but there was a certain finality to it. "You're not going anywhere until we sort this out," he said, his tone no longer as aggressive, but colder, like a man who had made up his mind about something. He wasn't asking anymore. He was demanding. Maria's breath caught in her throat. "Sort what out? I told you, I don't know what you're talking about." But as she spoke, she realized the futility of her words. Callahan had already made up his mind. The moment her father's name had been brought up, everything had changed. He wasn't listening to her anymore. Callahan didn't respond immediately. He simply reached for his radio again and spoke into it, his words barely audible. Maria couldn't make out the response, but she saw his jaw tighten as the conversation continued. The unease in the pit of her stomach grew. What was he waiting for? Was he calling for backup? Was he planning to arrest her? She had never felt more trapped in her entire life. This wasn't just a random cop with a chip on his shoulder. It was something far bigger, something deeply personal. He turned off the radio and faced her again, his gaze cold, almost predatory. "You're going to regret this," he muttered under his breath, as though speaking to himself. Maria didn't know if he was talking to her or to the world around him, but she couldn't ignore the chilling weight of his words. Her thoughts were spinning, trying to find a way out. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She had never asked for any of this. She had never asked for a complicated past or a father whose decisions had led him down a dangerous road. But now, she was being punished for it. She had worked so hard to build a normal life, to break away from everything she had once known. And now it was all coming crashing down. Maria could feel her anxiety rising, but she fought to keep her composure. She couldn't let Callahan see her break. She had to think clearly, had to figure out a way out of this. The thought of staying silent, of letting him control everything, was terrifying. But what choice did she have? Callahan had already made up his mind about her, and there was no easy way to undo the damage. But then, as if by instinct, something inside her clicked. She wasn't just a victim in this situation. She had a voice. She had rights. This wasn't going to be the end of her story. She could fight back. Summoning all the courage she could muster, Maria looked at him directly. "What do you want from me, officer?" she asked, her voice steady, though it betrayed the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "What do you think you know that's going to make a difference?" Callahan didn't answer at first. He simply stared at her, his face unreadable. It was clear that his mind was somewhere else, lost in his thoughts, processing something that had deeply shaken him. It was almost as if he was wrestling with something within himself, something that was beyond the scope of the conversation they were having. Maria pressed on. "I'm not going to let you drag me into something that's not my fault. I've lived here for years. I've built my life here. You don't get to decide who I am based on a name from the past." His eyes flickered, the anger still there, but mixed with something else, something that Maria couldn't quite place. It was a vulnerability, maybe even a hint of fear. For a brief moment, Callahan looked away, his gaze shifting toward the empty road ahead. It was as if he were conflicted, as if he didn't know how to resolve the situation that was now spiraling out of his control. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, his voice tight, "but I know who your father was, and I know the kind of things he was involved in. You think I don't know? You think the people in this town don't remember?" Maria's eyes burned with frustration. "My father made choices that I'm not responsible for," she shot back, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not him. I've never been him. You don't get to punish me for his mistakes." Callahan's eyes darkened again. But this time, it was different. His anger wasn't directed at her, but at something deeper, something buried in his own past. Maria could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, as though trying to keep control of something that was slipping through his fingers. "This isn't about you," Callahan muttered, almost to himself. "It's about what your father did. You don't get to walk away from that. You don't get to just erase it." The words hit Maria like a slap. She could feel her pulse in her ears, the tightness in her chest growing with each word he spoke. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was something much more personal to him. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about his perception of justice, and how deeply ingrained that perception had become in the way he viewed the world. Maria stared at him for a long moment, taking in the man sitting next to her. She had always seen him as a faceless figure, a cop doing his job. But now she saw something else, something broken, something human. It wasn't just about power or control anymore. He was haunted by something. Maria didn't know what it was, but it was clear that the way he was treating her had less to do with who she was and more to do with his own demons. "I don't know what you want me to do, officer," she said softly, her voice no longer angry, but tired. "But I'm not going to be the scapegoat for something I didn't do." Callahan stared at her for what felt like an eternity, the tension between them hanging in the air. His lips twitched slightly, as though he were considering something, weighing a decision. But in the end, he only shook his head. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You have no idea what this means." The words struck Maria deep in her chest. She didn't understand. She was the one being accused of something she hadn't done. She was the one being dragged into a mess that wasn't hers. How could he say she didn't understand? "I understand more than you think," she replied, her voice firm, but a tremor still evident. "I understand that you're using my father's past to make me pay for something that's not my fault. But that stops now." Callahan turned away from her, his eyes fixed on the road once more. Maria could see the conflict written on his face, the internal battle that raged inside him. It wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about her father. This was about something much bigger, something that neither of them could control. The car slowed to a stop in front of an empty building, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Maria sat there, her body tense, waiting for Callahan's next move. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. This encounter was far from over. It had only just begun. Maria's eyes scanned the building ahead, her heart thundering in her chest. The emptiness around them seemed to echo her thoughts. Everything felt surreal, as if she were trapped in a dream she couldn't wake up from. Officer Callahan had pulled the car over, stopping in front of a dilapidated, abandoned warehouse at the edge of town. The place had always been there, a forgotten relic of a more industrious time, but no one ever came near it anymore. It felt out of place now, like an old wound that had never fully healed, and now it was bleeding again. She didn't know if she should feel fear or confusion. Her whole body was tense, but she remained still, waiting for him to explain his next move. Callahan, too, remained silent. He hadn't moved a muscle since they had stopped. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white, his posture rigid. He didn't seem to want to speak, as if the weight of the situation was pressing down on him, suffocating him, and he didn't know how to break the tension. The minutes stretched on, and Maria began to feel the suffocating silence press against her chest. Finally, he turned to her, his eyes hard and distant. "This is where your father's trail ended," he said flatly. "You don't know this place, but I do. I've seen it all. This warehouse. This is where everything went down, where everything started, and where it ended." Maria blinked, trying to process his words. Her father had always been a distant figure in her life, one she had intentionally distanced herself from in order to create a new identity, one that wasn't tied to his controversial past. But now this place, this dark and forgotten corner of Willow Creek, had suddenly become the epicenter of everything she had tried to leave behind. Her stomach churned with unease, a deep sense of dread filling her as she imagined what he was about to say next. "I don't know what you think happened here," Maria said, her voice quiet but steady. "But I'm not my father. I'm not involved in whatever he did." Callahan didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened the car door and stepped out, slamming it shut behind him. Maria watched him for a moment, unsure if she should follow, but the fear that held her in place was stronger than any urge to move. She stayed in her seat, her fingers digging into the leather upholstery, her thoughts racing. What was he going to do? Why bring her here? The silence dragged on as she hesitated, and then, as if reading her thoughts, Callahan spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of years of anger and unresolved questions. "Your father wasn't just some activist, Maria," he said, the words almost bitter in his mouth. "He was involved in things that no one knew about, things that no one could ever understand. The stuff he did, it's still here. It's still part of this town. And now you're here, trying to pretend it doesn't matter. But it does." Maria's heart pounded louder in her ears as she processed his words. "I don't care about his past," she said, trying to keep the trembling out of her voice. "I'm not responsible for him. I've spent my whole life trying to move on. I've worked hard to build a life here, and I've earned every inch of it." Callahan looked over his shoulder at her, his gaze piercing. "I know you've worked hard. I see it. But you're standing on the same soil that he walked on, Maria. Your father made decisions, big ones, that affected more people than you'll ever understand. You can't just bury it and hope it goes away. It doesn't work like that." Maria's frustration flared. But it wasn't the frustration of someone who had been wrongly accused. It was the frustration of someone who had had enough. Enough of being judged for things she had no control over. Enough of being tied to a past she had no say in. She opened the car door and stepped out into the cold morning air, the chill biting into her skin, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid of him. Not anymore. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, walking toward him slowly. Her voice shook, but it was no longer from fear. It was from anger, from years of holding everything in. You don't get to use my father's mistakes to control my life. You don't get to decide what I am, who I am, based on things I had no part in. I didn't make his choices. I wasn't there when all of that happened." Callahan's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. He seemed to be processing her words, but the storm behind his eyes was only growing stronger. "You don't think I know what this does to people," he said, almost quietly, as if the weight of his own history was finally breaking through the facade he had so carefully constructed. "You think I don't know what it's like to be dragged down by the things your father did. The whole town knows what happened here. People talk. People remember." Maria's chest tightened. She could see that there was more to Callahan than the angry, authoritative figure she had encountered earlier. There was a brokenness to him, something personal, something that ran deeper than just a cop trying to uphold the law. He wasn't just punishing her. He was punishing himself too. Maybe he thought he was holding on to some warped sense of justice. Maybe he thought that if he dragged her down into the same pit of guilt and regret he had fallen into, it would somehow absolve him of the things he couldn't change. "I'm not him," Maria said, her voice calm now, but firm. "I'm not my father. And you're not going to make me into something I'm not just because you think you can. You can't control me. Not anymore." For the first time, Callahan seemed to hesitate. His gaze flickered, uncertainty flashing in his eyes. The wall he had built around himself was starting to crumble, piece by piece. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Maria took another step toward him, her resolve hardening with each passing second. "Take a good look at me, officer," she said. "You can keep holding onto your anger, or you can let it go. But you're not going to drag me down with you. Not today. Not ever." Callahan's face softened for a brief moment, as though he had finally seen her, not as a reflection of her father, but as herself. But the moment passed, and the tension between them remained, thick and heavy. He took a step back, lowering his eyes, as if he had been defeated by his own inner turmoil. But when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost resigned. "I'm sorry," he said, his words barely audible. "I don't know what to do with this. With you. You remind me too much of him, and it's not something I can just forget." Maria didn't know how to respond. The apology, if it could even be called that, felt hollow. She wasn't looking for his forgiveness. She wasn't looking for redemption. All she wanted was to be free of the chains that had bound her to her father's legacy, free of the expectations and accusations that had followed her for so long. "You don't have to forgive me, officer," she said softly, turning her back to him and walking toward the car. "But you need to let go. You're not going to fix what happened. None of us can. But we can move on." As she reached the driver's side door, she turned back to him one last time. Callahan stood there, his back to the warehouse, his eyes distant and unreadable. The moment between them was over, but she knew, deep down, that it wasn't just over for her. It wasn't over for the town. It wasn't over for Callahan. None of them could walk away from the past, not entirely. But maybe, just maybe, they could start to rebuild, one step at a time. Maria climbed into the car, her hands shaking slightly as she started the engine. The road ahead seemed uncertain, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. She had faced the worst of it, had confronted the past that had haunted her for so long. And now, she was free, at least for today. As she drove away, she didn't look back. The past was behind her. It was time to move forward. The days following that encounter with Officer Callahan felt like a blur. Maria returned to her normal routine, trying to keep her focus on the small things that made her life hers. The hum of the classroom, the smiles of her students, the quiet moments at home where she could breathe. But the weight of that day, the confrontation, the revelation of her father's past, the tension with Callahan, it lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the town itself had changed in ways she hadn't fully grasped yet. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the question of whether Callahan had truly let go of his anger, or whether he was still holding on, just waiting for the right moment to strike again. The town of Willow Creek, like so many small towns, was a place of secrets. Beneath its quiet streets and familiar faces, there were stories buried deep, stories of people who had done things they couldn't undo, of histories that had been forgotten or twisted by time. And now Maria realized her father's story was one of those buried secrets, resurrected in a way that made it impossible for her to ignore. At first, the town reacted in quiet, measured ways. Whispers followed her around the school, in the grocery store, on the streets. Some people seemed to look at her differently, as though they were seeing her for the first time, not as the woman who had taught their children for years, but as something else entirely. A daughter of a man they all remembered, a man whose actions had shaped their lives in ways they didn't fully understand. And some people, those who had always harbored doubts or suspicions, now saw her as a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The guilt, the blame. It wasn't just her father's anymore. It was hers too. But there were others who stood by her. Her friends, her colleagues, even some of the parents of her students who, after hearing the story, came to her quietly, offering their support. It was in these moments, in the warmth of their kindness, that Maria found some semblance of peace. She wasn't her father. She wasn't responsible for the choices he had made. And yet, the weight of the past still clung to her, like an invisible chain she couldn't shake off. The small acts of support helped, but they didn't erase the tension in the air. It didn't change the way the town had been forever altered by the revelation of her father's legacy. Callahan's role in this was more complicated than Maria had expected. In the days after their confrontation, he seemed to vanish from her life, as quickly as he had entered it. The investigation into his actions was murky. Too many questions, too many unanswered calls, too much political pressure from higher-ups to make things go away. It seemed like Willow Creek wasn't ready for the truth to come to light, and neither were the authorities. Callahan was quietly reassigned to a different part of the county, away from Willow Creek, leaving the town to breathe again. But Maria knew the truth. Nothing had really changed. It wasn't just Callahan who had carried the weight of the past. It was the whole town. It was in the air they breathed, the unspoken words that lingered after every conversation, the way people avoided eye contact when the subject of her father came up. The investigation into her father's involvement in the town's history was closed. The files were sealed. The whispers of corruption, of radical movements, of old alliances and betrayals. These were things that the town tried to push back into the shadows where they belonged. But Maria knew better. There were things left unsaid. There were things that would never truly be forgotten. It was a strange and bittersweet feeling, to be caught in the middle of a history she hadn't lived, a legacy she hadn't asked for. And yet, Maria felt a strange sense of ownership over it now. She couldn't change it. She couldn't rewrite it. But she could own it. She could take that dark legacy and turn it into something new, something that was hers. The people of Willow Creek would have to come to terms with their past, just as she had. The town would have to decide whether to keep burying the truth or whether to finally confront it and start healing. Maria had no illusions that it would be easy. People didn't change overnight, but she wasn't waiting for them anymore. She was going to move forward, with or without their approval. In the weeks that followed, Maria began to take on a new role within the community. No longer just a teacher, no longer just a quiet observer. She found herself speaking at local town meetings, organizing events that encouraged open dialogue about the town's history and the ways in which it had shaped the present. It wasn't about pointing fingers, she told them. It was about healing. It was about acknowledging the darkness that had clouded their past, about facing it head-on, and moving forward together. Some people resisted, of course. The past was a painful thing, something that people didn't want to revisit. But Maria found that the more she spoke, the more the town started to listen. Slowly, quietly, change began to take root. As for Callahan, Maria never saw him again. She heard rumors, whispers that he had been transferred far away, that he had left law enforcement altogether. Some said he had been seeking therapy. Others said he had disappeared into the shadows, never to be heard from again. Maria wasn't sure what had happened to him, and in truth, she didn't care. She couldn't allow his unresolved demons to hold power over her any longer. She had faced him, and in doing so, she had faced herself. She had seen her own fears, her own weaknesses, and she had walked through them. She had found her voice, and she was determined to keep it. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still many conversations to be had, many moments of discomfort to navigate. There were still people who looked at her with suspicion, still those who couldn't let go of the past. But Maria had learned something invaluable, that the past didn't define her. She was more than the daughter of a man whose choices had rippled through the town for years. She was her own person, and she had the power to shape her own story. One evening, as Maria stood outside the school watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, she couldn't help but reflect on everything that had brought her to this moment. The struggle, the pain, the anger, it had all been a part of the process, a process of unearthing the buried truths, of confronting the darkness, and most importantly, of choosing to move forward. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that whatever came, she would face it head-on, just as she had with Callanan. She had faced the worst of what the past had to offer, and now she was free to build her own future. The town had changed, and so had she. It wasn't perfect, and it would never be, but it was hers, and for the first time in a long time, Maria felt at peace with that.